You would be opening your Bibles to the book of Joshua. We are in chapter 5 this morning. I'm hoping to get into chapter 6 as well. I don't imagine that these chapters will take us super long to get through. Joshua chapter 5. And of course, Israel has just crossed over the Jordan. They have just entered into this land of promise. And upon the response to that, in verse 1 of chapter 5, it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, that their hearts melted. And there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make for yourself flint knives, and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time." So Joshua made himself flint knives, and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Ha'araloth. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished, because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that He would not let them see the land, which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Their children, whom He raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not circumcised them along the way. Now when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. While the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on that day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. All right, so we might first ask the question in these verses 1 through 12, the main purpose of which is the preparation for the conquest. We might first ask, what was the reaction of the nations when they crossed the Jordan River? And where have we seen this before? We saw this in the previous, we saw them cross the Jordan in the previous chapter. I cheated last time and read verse 1 of chapter 5 last week, but the chapter division is probably not in the best of spots, to be honest. It's because we crossed the Jordan, and here's the reaction of all the nations right here. But how did the Canaanites react? Their hearts sank. They melted. Right. They were afraid. Don, did you have something? Okay. All right. There's no longer any spirit. The Jordan was unfordable at this time of year, and yet somehow Israel has managed to cross it anyway. James. Where have we heard this statement about their hearts melting before? Yes.
Rahab mentioned it.
Yes.
And she mentioned it about the time they were crossing
Jericho.
Well, the Red Sea. Yeah, when we talked
Oh,
as they were traveling.
Yes, that's correct. Chapter 2 in verses 9 through 11, she said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you." Why? Verse 10, "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath." So yeah, this statement about their hearts melting recurs here in chapter 5. Okay, and they're circumcised at the hill of Gibeath Ha'araloth, which I guess that's an appropriate name. It means hill of the foreskins. Why is circumcision necessary? And there's more than one right answer to this. So it's a sign of the covenant. Good. Genesis 17. Done. Oh. Yes. Here's a question. Is the circumcision of the heart, is that unique to the new covenant? No. In Deuteronomy 10 in verse 16, for instance, it commands the people of Israel to be circumcised in their hearts. But I always thought it was interesting that that commandment was given to a nation of people who we learn here was physically uncircumcised. It was more important for them to have their hearts right with the Lord than to have the physical sign on them, even in the days of Moses. You know, the heart was always been important to God's people. That's why the first and foremost command in the law is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. And now, we learn something else in this passage in chapter 5 about the fact that they're circumcised here. What is it?
It was a sign of covenant relationship.
So they haven't been doing their job. Done. I'm sorry, say.
All of it had already been.
Yes, okay, so ultimately what we learn here is that Israel had not been circumcised in the wilderness. And why not? I'm sorry? They didn't have time to... Well, they had 40 years in the wilderness. I think they had a lot of... Yeah, what are you doing for 40 years? They were moving. All right. They couldn't have stopped once to do it.
That generation was not faithful.
Yes, that generation was not faithful. That's what the text says right there in verse 6, that they walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord. They did not obey the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn he would not let them see the land. It makes sense that if they're going to be disobedient about whether or not they can take the promised land, they're probably going to be disobedient about cutting on themselves too. We can put that together as well. He cites specifically the incident of Numbers chapter 14 where they sent the 12 spies out and 2 of them came back and said, "The Lord has given it into our hands." And the other 10 say, No, he hasn't. We can't take this. The people are too big for us. And so what happened, of course, was that the older generation perished in the wilderness. They were finished in the wilderness, but the younger generation in verse 8 finishes circumcising all their children. It says something about parental failure, too. You were circumcised on the 8th day in Israel. You're an 8-day-old child. Do you have any control over that? No, it's ultimately mom and dad that have control over that one. So the fact that they weren't being circumcised on the 8th day suggests that mom and dad have not succeeded in their duty. They have not fulfilled their obligation as parents. So there's another issue there. Of course, in the New Covenant, it's a little different. Circumcision is not bestowed by the parents. Being in covenant with Christ is not something that mom and dad thrust upon you. They do not teach, again, each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, "Know the Lord," because they will all know me. There is an element of choice in the matter and all of that. There is a need, and there's always been a need for people to make their faith their own, but that need becomes highlighted more emphatically in the New Covenant. And in verse 9 it says, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." What is that talking about? What was the reproach of Egypt? Verse 9. Slavery, okay. They got rid of their slavery by the time they entered the Promised Land. Yeah, I think that's more the idea, is that you have this general disobedience, this general longing for Egypt in that whole generation of people. And one of the last symptoms of that reproach of Egypt is, well, we didn't circumcise our children in the wilderness. Everybody who came out of Egypt was circumcised, but those who perished in the wilderness did not carry out that obligation on their children. So I think reproach of Egypt is probably just a reference to the general disobedience of that Exodus generation. That's more, especially in light of verse 6, that they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn. So here in these verses you see kind of an overturning of that past disobedience, the transition into a new generation. If the Lord is going to be with these people, then, well, they have to be obedient to Him. There's a little wordplay too. The word Gilgal is a play on the Hebrew term for roll, galal. The Lord has rolled away the reproach from you at Gilgal. Let's... I already mentioned Deuteronomy 10:16, where the people were told to circumcise their hearts to the Lord. Moses said that when the vast majority of the nation was physically uncircumcised. And so ultimately the first and foremost concern with the law was not outward ritual, but the inner workings of the heart. I love what Paul says in Romans chapter 2 on this, in verses 25 through 29. It says that indeed circumcision is of value if you practice the law, but if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if the uncircumcised man keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you, who, though having the letter of the law and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God. And God tells them, circumcise your hearts. He tells them that first, and then he tells them, work on this physical requirement here when they cross the Jordan, after they pass through the waters. There's another dimension to all of this too, though. Was what God telling Israel, what is Israel about to do? They're about to go to war. Now, you're about to go to war. What's the last thing you're going to tell your army to start doing? Start mutilating yourselves, yes! Just from a secular standpoint, does this seem like a good idea to you? It was Simeon and Levi, but Genesis 34, yes, that's a good example to bring up. Simeon and Levi, in Genesis 34, they say, "Oh, we'll make a covenant with the Shechemites. We'll make a covenant with you. But first, all of you have to be circumcised, because that would be inappropriate if you didn't do that." And of course, on the third day, while they were in pain, Simeon and Levi show up and they ransack the whole city and they kill everybody. This is not a good idea from a purely secular military perspective. Why is that? Well, because taking a knife to your foreskin right before battle does not help your chances in battle itself. But God still commands it anyway. Why? Yes, because He is in control of what will happen. Because Israel's physical preparation is not nearly as important as their spiritual preparation. Because their obedience to God is more important than their military capability. When God is with the army, human standards of preparation are entirely irrelevant. Because God is with them, and He is in control. And there's a greater danger of going into battle, of going into the Lord's purposes while uncircumcised for them. You might think of Moses in Exodus chapter 4, whenever the Lord meets him on the way and seeks to put him to death. And Moses hasn't circumcised his son, apparently, for whatever reason. And so, you have that whole story going on. Moses, who was about to be the spokesman for God's people, about to be put to death over this issue. So in the context of the Israelite covenant, God saw this as important. The nation's obedience to God is supreme to everything else, and supreme to whether or not they can or cannot win the battle. There's an interesting little tidbit about the way that God operates on the battlefield. Did I see a hand? Keith. Okay.
Power of God. All them.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I could see how that would fit. I'll have to think about that. Yeah, but that's an interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, it would fit with verse 1 definitely. For all we know, he maybe means a double meaning by it too. There's another idea as well. I'll have to think about that though. I hadn't even considered that side of it. So thank you for bringing that up. In verses 10 through 12, they celebrate the Passover. Why is that significant? Right. Well, it's at exactly the same time. First day of the 14th month. It's the prescription in the laws. That was the day they would celebrate it. Dennis. They haven't celebrated it in a while. The last time they celebrated it was... the last recorded time they celebrated it was in, I think, Numbers chapter 9. Apparently they did observe it at least once when they were at Sinai, but they do not appear to have observed it during the time in the wilderness. And it was considered, anybody who ate the Passover when uncircumcised would be cut off from the people, is what it says in Exodus 12 in verse 48. So the two are connected concepts. You couldn't eat the Passover unless you were a circumcised Israelite. It's true, they didn't have access to the unleavened bread. And was manna unleavened? Maybe, I don't know. They didn't have bitter herbs. They just had to find the manna on the ground. What about the manna? Why does the manna stop, by the way? They finally eat the first fruits of the land. The manna had been given for 40 years and just come out of the sky constantly. And the stopping of the manna happens after they cross the Jordan and first eat of the produce of the land. They no longer need it because they're enjoying the fruit of the promised land. They're eating off of trees that they did not plant and vineyards that they did not plant. They're about to begin living in cities and houses that they did not build per the promises of God. So these are just a couple of different ideas here. Anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions up through verse 12? All right, verse 13. It came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for your adversaries?" He said, "No, rather I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out, no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand. You, with its king and its valiant warriors. You shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times. The priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead. Jenna offered to let me borrow the blocks for the city of Jericho and have you all march around them and stuff. Sorry. Class activities, I guess. This is not a great chapter division, by the way, because Joshua starts having this conversation at the end of chapter 5, and then it's like, well, wait, what happened to that? Well, that's the conversation he's having at the beginning of chapter 6 as well. The chapter division kind of breaks it with this parenthetical comment about Jericho being heavily fortified. But who is this person that Joshua encounters in verses 13 through 15 of chapter 5? Commander of the Lord's army, captain of the Lord's host. Okay, yeah. Probably some kind of angelic figure. You see encounters like this in the Bible. Jacob wrestles with an angel in Genesis 32. Moses encounters God in Exodus 4. And both of them were violent and God fought them. But here Joshua is willing and God fights for his enemies instead. He has a drawn sword. Joshua bows to him. Some people interpret that as a form of worship. I think a little too much is getting read into that. Bowing is just, in the ancient world, in the Old Testament in particular, people would bow to each other just as a form of greeting. It was, you would see it happen. It's all over Genesis and it's all over other places. And I'm not particularly sold on some of these elaborate theories. But there's a really elaborate theory that's just really Jesus before he came to earth and all this other stuff. I'm not going to get into that. I know brethren who are well studied who think that, but I don't see it. So, you can, whether or not you want to conclude that or not, I'll leave to your study and your decision-making process. I don't really think...
It's the only other time
Yes, and, I was about to get to that actually, but yeah. The next question was, where have we seen the statement in 5:15 before? Well, that was at the burning.
might indicate that it might be
Well, who appeared to Moses in the burning bush? It says an angel of the Lord appeared to him in Exodus chapter 3 in verse 2. You gotta... Sometimes what will happen is an angel of the Lord will come, a messenger of the Lord. They'll begin speaking to the person. And throughout the rest of the text, it'll just say, the Lord says this, the Lord said this, the Lord said this. The beginning of the passage said it was an angel of the Lord or a messenger of the Lord. So, who's speaking? The Lord or the messenger? Well, the Lord speaking through the messenger. It seems to me, it's very rare that the Lord speaks directly to someone in the Bible. He usually sends a prophet or a messenger or a dream or a vision of some sorts. Moses is one of the few exceptions where the Lord speaks with him mouth to mouth eventually. But in Exodus 3, it appears that it says in verse 2 that an angel of the Lord was what appeared to him in the burning bush. We could get off on a huge tangent and spend forever talking about this, just to let you know, and I'm not going to go completely down that road. But this does remind us of Exodus 3 in the burning bush. Take off your shoes because the ground that you are standing on is holy. Why bring this up? Why say this? Besides the fact that it's true, of course. Why remind us of the burning bush encounter? The Lord was with him just like he was with Moses. This is the same thing he's been saying since chapter 1. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. The people said, just as we obeyed Moses, when we obeyed him, we will obey you. The Lord will exalt Joshua so that they will know that I have been with you. Just as I've been with Moses, I will be with you. This encounter with this angel of the Lord figure on holy ground is another way of exalting Joshua in the sight of the people and kind of, putting him through the experience that Moses had. And it helps us to see more of how Joshua replaces Moses by having a similar encounter with God's messengers. Now, There is a parenthetical note in verse 1 of chapter 6 about how Jericho is tightly shut. Just like we saw in chapter 2. It raises the question. It's got high walls. It's tightly shut. How are we going to breach the walls of this thing? How are we going to get into this city? Well, from a military secular standpoint, we're talking about a long siege. Maybe years of siege against this heavily fortified city. But they take it in 7 days. There is no lengthy siege. There is no big weaponry. There is no battering rams brought against the wall. It is simply a following of the Lord's instructions here. The Lord says, I have given Jericho into your hand. It's a free gift. Nothing left for you to do, right? No? Is there nothing left for Israel to do?
Yes, there is.
Well, what's left? They have to take the city, yeah. Even though it's a free gift, they still have to take it. They still have to obey God's instructions in order to take it. This is one of my pet peeves is people, they try to act like free gift means you don't do anything. You can sit on your sofa and you got the free gift. There's nothing you have to do to obtain it. Well, that's never been true in the Bible. It's not true in the Old Testament. It's not true in the New Testament. There's always some kind of thing that God wants people to do to get the gift. Keith.
We need.
Okay. And there's and the other side of this, of course, is the fact that, the Lord who's providing them with the food in the land of Canaan? Really? The Lord's still providing them with food. It's not raining from the sky anymore. It's providing for them in a different means as well. So it's not that the Lord stopped providing them with food, it's that He stopped providing them with manna from heaven. Now He's providing them with the produce of the land which He has given to them, which they did not really do anything to earn for themselves. Just like they had to go out and collect manna, they still have to go out and harvest food. That hasn't changed, but it's still the free gift of God when it's all said and done. So, Israel's obedience is still required. Now, does this battle strategy make much sense from a human standpoint? Let's march around the city and blow horns a few times. Nothing in this makes sense as a secular battle strategy, right? Yes, exactly. And that's what this whole story becomes about. It's about, the Lord is the one who fights for Israel. The Lord is the one who owns the battle. Now, they march around the city once a day for 6 days. They march around the city 7 times on the 7th day. They blow 7 trumpets, one of the most important instruments ever invented. It's in the Bible. And the walls will fall down. In verse 5, he calls it the ram's horn. Why is that significant? What was a ram's horn used for? Worship, okay, but particularly the ram's horn had another unique function in Israel's law. The trumpets, yes, they were used to summon people for worship, Numbers 10. But the ram's horn, mentioned in Leviticus, has another function. Whenever it wasn't sounded very often. They shouted, okay, this is one of those instances where I've got this idea in my head that Okay, well, in Leviticus chapter 25, God told Israel that their land, they would toil in their fields for 6 years, and every 7th year they would have a year of rest. And every 50 years, they would have what was known as the year of Jubilee, and they would sound the ram's horn throughout the land. Now, the ram's horn was something uniquely connected to the year of Jubilee, such that the word for Jubilee and the word for ram's horn are actually the same word in Hebrew. And what happened during the year of Jubilee? Among other things, the slaves were released, the debts were forgiven, and the land was reverted to its rightful owners. So whenever the ram's horn is sounded at the Battle of Jericho, there is a sense in which it is signifying that the land of Canaan has been reverted to its rightful owners, the ones that God has given it to. Every place on which the sole of their foot treads now belongs to them. And, of course, the Canaanites are no longer welcome there, and they become evicted as a consequence of this. The Jubilee is sounded, and the land returns to the rightful heirs of Israel. Any comments or questions? That was one question I did not word well. I apologize for that. Now let's talk about the taking of Jericho. 6 through 27. Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant. Let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." He said to the people, "Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord." And it was so, that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I tell you, shout, then you shall shout." So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once. And they came into the camp, and they spent the night in the camp. Now Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord while they continued to blow the trumpets. Thus the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did so for 6 days. Then on the 7th day they rose early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around the city 7 times. At the 7th time, when the priests blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city shall be under the ban. It and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab, the harlot, and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, so that you do not covet them, and take some of the things under the ban, and make the camp of Israel accursed, and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the priests blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout. And the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all she has out of there, as you have sworn to her." So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all she had. They also brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all she had Joshua spared, and she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation. With the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. First question we might ask, why does it take... the fact that it takes 7 days to capture Jericho, what does that remind us of? Creation. Oh, yeah.
I just wonder what the people of because they were part of Canaan.
Bewilderment, confusion. What is this? This doesn't make any sense.
Surely they had bow and arrows, they could have sniped.
Well, have you seen Veggie Tales? They just mock them from the wall is what they did.
I know, but you don't read that.
Yeah, I know. Veggie Tales, whatever. No, I agree. The text doesn't tell us anything about the inhabitants' reactions to this.
It does say that they blocked the door.
Yeah, they weren't.
Pulling up for whatever.
they were gearing up for siege for whatever reason, and they were gearing up for a lengthy siege. I'm sure the city could hold out for a while, but it wasn't a lengthy siege, was it? The 7 days do remind us of creation, and on the seventh day of creation, what happens? God rests. Now, throughout the book of Joshua, there's this association between the conquest of the land and getting rest, such as in chapter 113, that the Lord God gives you, your God gives you rest and will give you this land. Or in chapter 21, in verses 43 through 45, the Lord gave them all the land, not one word of the promise had failed. The Lord gave them rest on every side from their enemies. And you'll notice what else is present at these encircling the walls. It's not just the people, what goes with them. The Ark of the Covenant. We saw that back in chapter 3 when they crossed the Jordan. The Ark of the Covenant, usually has a role in the battle to play. God's presence on the battlefield in a sense. And so just as the Ark crossed the Jordan, it circles the city. And for 6 days the priests sound the trumpets, but there's no shout yet. And then on the seventh day they shout. It says in verse 17 that the city is under the ban. What does that mean? Don. It's what? Subject to the ban. There's a little thing going on in wordplay. In verse 21, it says they utterly destroyed everything. And when verse 17, when it says it's under the ban, those are actually the same word. It's, the noun and verbal forms of the same term. We're talking about this utter destruction, or sometimes referred to as devotion to destruction. We saw it, for instance, in Leviticus chapter 27, that a field could be devoted to God, but if a person was, quote-unquote, devoted in the same fashion, he would be put to death. It's the penalty for idolatry in Exodus 22 and verse 20. Any man that sacrifices to other gods will be utterly destroyed. He will be under the ban. And it's the prescribed fate for the Canaanites. And it's not your typical form of warfare. In typical warfare, they took prisoners. When a city was declared to be under the ban, there were no prisoners to be taken. The entire population was killed without exception. All the livestock usually were killed. Sometimes they were taken as spoil, but God usually had to specify that. The valuables would be put in the holy treasury, like we see here, and everything else would be burned. It's devoted to Yahweh's exclusive use, and everything that is either removed from the human existence altogether or it's put into the tabernacle treasury. Now, it is also the term used in 1 Samuel 15, whenever Saul is commanded to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. Go put them under the ban. No exceptions. He wasn't even allowed to take the livestock as spoil on that occasion. Everything had to be destroyed. And when Saul violates the ban, he comes under the curse. There's a sense in which he comes under the ban himself. God rejects him from being king. Now, here in Joshua, it's the same deal. You don't violate the ban. If you do, you come under the ban yourself. And so that's what happens in Joshua chapter 7. Whenever Achan sees some things, he says, well, I'd like that for myself. He takes it, and he takes things that were under the ban for devoted for destruction. When he did that, he defiled himself. And now he's placed under the ban. He and his whole household, and they stone them to death, they burn them, and then they stone them again. Because that's how bad it is. You don't violate the ban. So there's some ideas there. Now is there an exception to this ban? Rahab and her family. Okay, so Rahab and her family are spared. Everybody always wants to pitch a fit about how Achan and his family die. But what did Achan's family do? Well, what did Rahab's family do? It was just Rahab that acted, we're told in Joshua chapter 2, right? So, the lesson is the same in both cases, that what we do affects those around us. It has consequences for people around us. It's strange how justice only works one way for some people. Why is Rahab's family spared? They didn't do anything to be spared. They should have been killed with the rest of them, right? Well, no, that's not how that works. For all we know, they were in on helping too, but that's another discussion. But you'll notice that the destruction of the city alternates back and forth with the salvation of Rahab. Even though this entire population is destroyed, somebody is still saved out of it because they trusted God, because they were loyal to God, the true God. And so the ban is utter destruction, but it's not unconditional destruction. People can escape it. Individual Canaanites, and Rahab's not the only person that could have done this, but individual Canaanites are capable of escaping judgment if they turn to the Lord. How is today any different, I might ask? There's a sense in which the whole world is ultimately subject to the ban, and yet anyone can escape that judgment, that utter destruction that God has planned for the world by trusting Him, by turning to Him, by obeying Him, by following Him. It's that's the idea here behind the ban, but also the salvation from the ban. Another element of the ban is that the city must never be rebuilt. Well, you know history, you know that didn't happen with Jericho. Jericho has been rebuilt. And in fact, there's several places in the Old Testament where it continues to be mentioned after the fact. In verse 26, you see the curse that Joshua pronounces. If anybody ever rebuilds the city of Jericho, his firstborn son will die when he lays the foundation, and his youngest son will die when he sets up the gates, when he starts and finishes it, in other words. Anybody know when that's fulfilled offhand? Almost verbatim happens in 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 34. During the reign of Ahab, Ahab is not specifically the one who rebuilt the city, but it was rebuilt in his time. In his days, Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. 1 Kings 16:34. It's kind of interesting, that kind of suggests a unity to the narrative between Joshua and Kings, kind of strung together along that time. But the city falls, and Joshua is exalted, and his fame is in all the land. And I'll conclude with one reading from Hebrews chapter 11 very quickly. And the reason the walls of the city of Jericho fell, Hebrews 11 in verses 30 and 31, that by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 30 days. And by faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient, after she had welcomed the spies in peace. There's the elements right there in the story. Faith is what caused the destruction of Jericho, and faith is what caused the salvation of Rahab. So the question is, where's our faith? And where is our faith when it comes to the world? Those are all I have on those points. Anybody have any comments or questions up to the end of chapter 6? All right, we will pick up with chapter 7 next time.